Thistle Ridge, Nebraska, 1887. Ezra Hargrove had been standing outside the little clapboard church for nearly an hour, his collar too tight and his boots freshly polished, when he saw Adeline Marsh come walking up the road alone. Not on her brother's arm. Not in the ivory dress the whole town had watched her stitch by lamplight for 6 long weeks. She wore a plain gray traveling dress instead, and in both hands she carried a small canvas pouch, held out in front of her the way a person carries something they can no longer bear the weight of. The guests gathered near the church steps went quiet one by one, sensing trouble before either of them spoke a single word. "I can't walk in there yet," Adeline said, stopping close enough that Ezra could see her hands trembling around the pouch. "Not with your father's money still sitting between us like it was ever a debt to be paid off instead of a life either of us chose freely." She pressed the pouch into his hands. $380, every coin her family had managed to gather over 3 hard months, a fraction of the $550 her father had once owed his, but more cash than Ezra had expected to hold in his lifetime. He looked down at the money, then back at her, taking in the whole of her all at once. The shaking hands, the plain dress meant for traveling, not marrying, the guests already whispering behind gloved fingers. "Why bring it today?" he asked slowly, "instead of just not coming at all?" It was, Adeline would understand only much later, the one question that mattered more than any vow they'd been about to speak inside that church. 7 years earlier, her father, Warren Marsh, had borrowed $550 from Ezra's father, Elias Hargrove, the summer a late frost destroyed nearly every acre of grazing land in the county. There was no bank within 2 days' ride willing to lend a struggling rancher money on terms he could actually survive, so the two men had settled it the old way, over supper, with a handshake and a promise spoken plainly between neighbors. The debt would be forgiven in time, once Warren's daughter and Elias' son came of age and married. Nobody called it a sale. Everybody understood well enough what it was. Warren had insisted, right up until his death 4 years back, that he'd have wanted the match regardless, that Ezra Hargrove was simply the finest young man in the county, and the debt was only ever a coincidence riding alongside it. Adeline believed that story completely, until her father's death forced her older brother Silas to finally show her the ledger. $550, plus an interest neither family had ever agreed on out loud, still standing unpaid against her own future. A debt she had never once been told existed, until the day it became hers to carry. What Adeline had never told her brother, not once in 4 years, was that 2 nights before her father died, she'd found a letter tucked beneath the false bottom of his writing drawer, in his own unsteady hand, addressed to Elias Hargrove and never sent. She had read it only once by candlelight, her own breath caught somewhere in her chest, and then folded it back into the drawer where it still sat, because she had not yet found the courage to learn what it meant for certain. Silas had pushed the wedding forward within the year, the Marsh ranch struggling badly enough that the marriage meant survival as much as honor. Ezra's water rights ran along their shared fence line, and in a dry country, water mattered more than pride ever could. Adeline had said yes. She told herself, through months of careful courtship and a wedding dress sewn thread by thread, that she was saying yes to Ezra himself, a man she had genuinely come to like across 18 months of supervised visits and church socials. She had not fully convinced herself of that until the morning of her own wedding, staring at the dress hanging on her door, understanding all at once that she could not walk into that church without knowing which reason had truly carried her there. Ezra was 29, had inherited both his father's ranch and his father's ledger 3 years back, and had spent the length of the engagement quietly hoping Adeline would never learn exactly how plainly the arrangement had been written down in his father's careful hand. He had liked her from the first supervised visit, long before either of them had any real say in whether liking each other mattered to the outcome. She was sharper than most of the county gave her credit for, quick to catch him in a lazy argument, entirely unimpressed that his family owned twice the land hers did. He had found himself, across those 18 months, actually courting her in whatever narrow space the arrangement allowed, bringing her books instead of flowers, arguing cattle prices with her at socials, while Silas hovered nearby pretending not to listen, learning the particular way her jaw set when she'd caught him in a weak argument, moments before he'd fully realized it himself. He had never once told her the debt could have been forgiven outright, years earlier, without any marriage required at all. His own father had died believing the match was destiny wearing the clothes of convenience, and Ezra had inherited that belief along with the ledger, telling himself more than once that raising the subject would only complicate a courtship that seemed, on its own separate merits, to be going somewhere good regardless. It was easier, some quieter and more cowardly part of him reasoned, to let an old arrangement finish the work rather than trust his own nerve to ask her plainly. He had not expected her to arrive at the church with the money instead of the dress. Watching her hands shake around the pouch, he understood plainly enough that he should have said the truth out loud long before she'd had to walk across a churchyard to force the question out of him herself. "Because I couldn't stand at that altar not knowing," Adeline said, her chin lifted despite the tremor still running through her hands. "Whether I was marrying you or marrying my way out of a debt my own father signed away before I was old enough to have any say in it, I needed to know which one it was before I spoke a vow I couldn't take back." "And which is it?" Ezra asked. "Now that you're standing here having given the money back instead of simply riding away entirely?" Adeline hadn't fully considered that question until he asked it, and found, turning it over in the midday heat of the churchyard, that the honest answer arrived slower and heavier than she expected any answer of hers to arrive that morning. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "I know I couldn't marry you today with that money sitting unpaid between us. What I don't know is whether that means I don't want you at all, or whether it just means I needed to hand back what was never mine to marry away before I could work out the rest of it honestly." Somewhere behind them, near the hitching post, a horse shifted and stamped once against the dry ground, and neither of them turned to look at it. Ezra's jaw worked slowly, like a man deciding whether a truth he'd carried for years was finally ready to leave him. "Then let's work out the rest of it honestly," he said, "starting with something my own father should have made plain to yours a long time ago." He never got the chance to finish it, because it was in that same breath that Silas Marsh came striding up the churchyard path, his face carrying an anger Adeline hadn't seen on him since the week their father died, and behind him, a folded and yellowed piece of paper gripped tight in his fist that Adeline recognized instantly, and had never told a living soul that she'd already read. Silas stopped a few paces from them, breathing hard from the walk, the folded paper trembling slightly in his grip the same way Adeline's hands had trembled around the money pouch minutes before. His eyes went first to Ezra, then settled hard on his sister. "You knew," he said. "All this time you knew, and you let me push this wedding forward like our whole future depended on it." Adeline felt the ground shift under her before she even understood what he was holding. "Silas, put that back where you found it. That was never meant for you to read." "I wasn't looking for it," Silas said. "I was looking for the deed to the west pasture, going through father's drawer same as I have a dozen times since he died, and this time the false bottom had come loose. Guess 3 years of me pulling that drawer open finally wore it thin enough to slip." He held the paper out toward her, not gently. "You want to tell me why our father wrote a letter to Elias Hargrove he never sent, or should I read it out loud right here in front of half the wedding party?" Ezra's hand found Adeline's arm, not holding her back, just steady, the way a man stands close to someone about to take a hard fall. "What letter?" he said quietly, and Adeline understood there was no keeping it folded away any longer. "Your father wrote to mine," she said, 2 nights before he died. I found it by accident going through his desk after the funeral, and I read it once, and then I put it back because I didn't know what to do with what it said, and I was afraid of what it would mean for this family if I told anyone. Then tell me now, Ezra said. Silas unfolded the letter himself, his voice rough as he read it aloud in the hot churchyard air, guests still watching from a careful distance near the steps, none of them close enough to hear the words, but every one of them watching the 3 figures standing apart from everybody else. Warren Marsh had written to Elias Hargrove that the debt between their families was, in his own heart, already settled, had been settled for 2 years by then, ever since a hard winter when Elias quietly sent feed and seed to the Marsh ranch without ever being asked, and without ever mentioning it again. Warren wrote that he no longer wanted his daughter's marriage tied to any ledger at all, that he intended to release both children from the arrangement entirely, and let whatever grew between them grow on its own honest ground, free and clear, the way any marriage ought to begin. He had meant to ride over and tell Elias so face to face. He had meant to do it the following week. He died in his sleep 4 nights before he got the chance. The churchyard stayed quiet a long moment after Silas finished reading. Somewhere near the hitching post, a horse tossed its head, harness jingling once into the stillness. "You read this years ago," Silas said, turning back to his sister, his voice cracking somewhere between fury and disbelief. "And you let me spend the last 12 months bleeding this family dry trying to save a debt that Father himself already meant to forgive before he even died. You let me push you into a wedding you never had to be pushed into at all." "I didn't know what it meant," Adeline said, and for the first time that morning her voice shook harder than her hands ever had. "I didn't know if it was truly his wish, or just something he wrote in a low moment and never meant to send. I didn't know if telling you would save this family, or break it apart faster than the debt ever could. I was 20 years old holding my dead father's unfinished letter, Silas, and I didn't trust myself to know which truth was the kind one and which was the dangerous one." "So you decided for all of us," Silas said, "by saying nothing." "I decided to marry Ezra anyway," Adeline said, "because whatever the letter meant about the debt, it didn't answer the only question that mattered to me, which was whether I actually wanted him. That was never Father's question to settle for me, Silas. Debt or no debt, letter or no letter. That part was always going to be mine alone to answer. If a story like this has ever made you sit with your own hardest choice a little longer, stay through to the end, because the truth in this one is only just starting to come out." Ezra had gone very still, the kind of stillness that comes over a man working something heavy through in silence before he trusts himself to speak it. When he finally did, his voice was quieter than either Marsh sibling expected. "My father never told me about the feed and seed," he said. "Never told me he sent it, never told me why. I found the receipts myself 2 years back going through his old accounts, and I always figured it was just decent neighborliness during a hard winter, nothing more than that. I didn't know your father saw it as anything close to settling the debt." He looked down at the torn edge of Silas's grip on the letter, then back up at Adeline. "Seems our fathers were a good deal more honest with each other in private than either of them ever managed to be with us." "Doesn't change what you did," Silas said to his sister, though some of the heat had gone out of his voice, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. 3 months, Adeline. 3 months I watched this family scrape together every spare dollar we had, sell 2 horses we couldn't afford to lose, go without new boots through a Nebraska winter, all to pay back a debt you already had good reason to believe our father meant to forgive." "I know," Adeline said, and did not try to defend it further, because there was no defending it, only the plain, hard truth of a young woman who had carried a secret too heavy and too uncertain to know what to do with, and had let her family suffer under its weight rather than risk being wrong about what it meant. "I'm not asking you to forgive me for that today, Silas. I'm only asking you to let me finish asking Ezra the question I wrote out here to ask, before anything else gets decided for either of us again." Silas looked at the torn letter in his hand, then folded it slowly back along its worn crease, the anger in his face settling into something more tired and more complicated. "Fine," he said. "Ask him. But I'd like to hear the answer myself this time, since it seems everybody in this family's been keeping the important things to themselves for years now, and I'm tired of finding out secondhand." Adeline turned back to Ezra, the churchyard sun full on both their faces now, the small crowd of wedding guests still watching from the steps with the particular held breath of people who know they are witnessing something they were never meant to see so plainly. She thought of the letter folded in her brother's hand, of 3 months of sacrifice made under a debt that might never have needed collecting, of 18 months of books instead of flowers and cattle prices argued at church socials, and found, standing there in her plain traveling dress with the money already returned, that the question she had come to ask had changed shape entirely from the one she'd carried. Across the churchyard that morning, "If the debt was never truly standing between us at all," she said slowly, "if it was already forgiven in both our Father's hearts long before either of us understood that, then I need to know something else from you now, Ezra Hargrove, and I need you to answer it as plainly as that letter answered mine. Was there ever a single day in these 18 months you courted me because you wanted me, and not because a dead man's ledger told you that you should?" Ezra didn't answer right away. He looked past her for a moment, out toward the dusty road they'd both walked to get to this church, as though searching for the exact morning he needed to point to, and when he spoke again his voice had lost every trace of hesitation. "There was a Sunday social back in the spring of your second year of courting," he said. "Your mare threw a shoe on the ride out, and your brother had already gone ahead with the wagon, and everybody standing around figured somebody would just lend you a horse to finish the ride. I remember thinking I didn't want you sitting on a borrowed horse next to me feeling like a burden I was tolerating for the sake of a debt. So I walked 5 miles alongside you, leading both our horses, because it seemed to me a man doesn't do that for an arrangement. A man does that because he'd rather walk 5 miles next to a particular woman than ride comfortable next to anybody else." He paused. "I never told you that was the day I stopped thinking of you as something owed to me and started thinking of you as something I wanted to earn honestly. I should have said it 100 times since. I only ever said it in my own head." Adeline felt something in her chest loosen that had been pulled tight since the moment she'd first opened her father's desk drawer. Not relief exactly. Something steadier than relief, closer to standing on solid ground after a long time not trusting the floor beneath her. "Then I don't think I need to walk into that church today," she said. "Not because the answer's no, Ezra, because I think I need to know I'm walking in there for myself, on a day nobody's father chose for us, and not because a whole town's already gathered expecting it." Ezra nodded slowly, like a man who understood exactly what she meant even though it cost him something to hear it. "Then we don't marry today," he said. "But I'd like the record to show I asked you plainly in front of your brother and half this churchyard, and you're the one who gets to decide when the day's right. Not your father's ledger, not my father's guilt. You." Word moved through the wedding guests quickly after that, the way word always does in a small town when a bride walks away from her own altar, though most of them had the decency to disperse quietly rather than linger and watch. By the time Adeline, Ezra, and Silas were the only 3 left standing in the churchyard, the sun had climbed high enough to throw short shadows across the dry grass, and none of them had said anything for a long moment. It was Silas who finally broke the silence, and what he said surprised his sister more than anything that had happened all morning. "I want to pay it back anyway," he said. "The debt. Whatever your father wrote in that letter, Ezra, whatever he meant by it. I don't want this family owing your family anything, forgiven or not. I've spent a year telling myself we needed this marriage to survive, and I find out today it was never true, and now all I can think is I don't want charity standing in the place of a debt either. I want to pay every dollar we still owe, on our own terms in our own time. That's pride talking, Silas, Adeline said gently, not sense. Maybe, Silas said, but it's my pride to have, same as it was your choice to walk across that churchyard with the money instead of the dress. Seems to me everybody in this family's earned the right to make one hard decision without being talked out of it today. Ezra studied him a moment, then gave a short nod. The kind one rancher gives another when he recognizes stubbornness he isn't going to argue with. Then we'll talk terms when you're ready, he said. Fair terms, agreed between the two of us this time, not written down by two dead men over supper. But I'll tell you now, Silas, so there's no confusion about it later. The water rights along the north fence stay shared regardless of what happens with any debt. That was never part of any ledger. That's just neighbors doing right by each other in dry country, and I don't intend to change that whichever way this settles. If a story like this has ever reminded you that pride and love don't always pull a family in the same direction, tell me in the comments which one you think Silas was really protecting that morning. The days that followed felt strange to Adeline in a way she hadn't expected. No wedding date sat waiting on the calendar. No dress hung finished on her door. She found herself walking the fence line most mornings instead, turning the whole business over slowly, the way a person turns a coin in their pocket without quite deciding to spend it. It was at the mercantile, 4 days later, that she ran into Junia Cole, who kept the account books for half the ranching families in the county and heard, by consequence, nearly everything worth knowing before anybody else did. Junia set her own basket down on the counter and studied Adeline with the frank, unhurried look of a woman who'd raised 4 daughters and had long since run out of patience for polite avoidance. Whole town's asking whether you're getting married or not, Junia said. I told them it wasn't any of our business, which it isn't, but I'll ask you plainly since you're standing right in front of me. Are you all right? You've had the look of somebody carrying 2 decisions at once and not sure which one's actually hers to make. I don't know if I called it off or just delayed it, Adeline admitted. I keep trying to work out if what I feel for him is real, separate from every ledger and letter and debt that's ever tangled itself up in it. Junia picked her basket back up, unhurried. Sounds to me like you already know the answer, she said, and you're just scared of trusting it without a good reason standing behind it. Most women never get handed the chance to ask that question at all, honey. Seems worth taking a few more days to answer it honestly, now that you have been. Adeline thought about that the whole walk home, the dust settling soft on her boots, a hawk circling somewhere high over the north pasture where Ezra's land ran up against her family's. She realized, examining the question without any debt or wedding date pressing down on the answer, that Junia had very likely been right. She missed him. Not his land, not the water rights, not the relief of a debt that might already be forgiven. She missed the actual company of a man who had walked 5 miles beside a lame horse rather than ride comfortable, who had listened to her arguments at church socials like they carried real weight, who had never once in 18 months made her feel smaller for disagreeing with him out loud. She was still turning that over the next morning when Silas came to find her in the kitchen, his face carrying a different kind of trouble than she'd seen on him all week, the kind that came from something outside the family entirely rather than something between them. I need to tell you something, he said, and I should have told you before now, but I kept hoping I'd find a way around it before it came to this. 3 months ago, when we were scraping together every dollar we could to pay back the Hargrove debt, I didn't just sell the horses. I took a note against the west pasture from Otis Latham at the bank in Prescott, figuring we'd clear the Hargrove debt first and worry about repaying Latham once the marriage settled our finances properly. He drew a breath. The note comes due in 3 weeks, Adeline. And whatever happens between you and Ezra, married or not, that's a debt no letter from father is ever going to forgive. Adeline set down the cup she'd been holding hard enough that it rattled against the saucer. You mortgaged the west pasture. Without telling me. I didn't want you carrying one more weight while you were already deciding whether to marry a man or not, Silas said. I told myself I'd have it settled quiet before you ever needed to know. I was wrong about that, same as I was wrong about a lot of things this week. How much? $210, plus what Latham calls his fair interest, which isn't fair at all if you ask anybody but Otis Latham. Due in 3 weeks, or he takes the west pasture outright. Same pasture that's kept 40 head fed through every winter since father was a boy on it. Adeline sat with that a long moment, the kitchen quiet except for the clock on the mantel and a horse shifting somewhere out in the yard. She thought of everything the past week had already taught her, about ledgers and letters and the difference between a debt paid out of fear and a choice made out of something steadier, and found that this time, at least, the answer came to her without needing a week of walking fence lines to find it. Then we tell Ezra, she said. Adeline, no. I won't have you going back to him with your hand out a second time in 1 week, not after everything he already forgave once. I'm not going with my hand out, Adeline said. I'm going to tell him the truth, same as I told him in that churchyard. What he chooses to do with it is his to decide, same as it was mine to decide whether I wanted to marry him. That's the whole of what I've learned this week, Silas. You don't get to protect people from the truth by deciding for them what they can and can't carry. Father tried that with his letter, and look how much grief it cost us all, sitting unsent in a drawer for 2 years. She found Ezra the following morning, mending the same stretch of north fence he'd been working the week before, the wire cutters set down beside him in the dust, a length of fresh post waiting to be driven into ground gone hard from a dry summer. He straightened when he saw her coming, wiping his hands on his trousers, and something in his face told her he'd already guessed this wasn't a social visit. She told him everything, the note against the west pasture, the 3 weeks, Silas's fear of asking for anything more from a family he already felt indebted to beyond repair. When she finished, Ezra was quiet long enough that she began to wonder if she'd made a mistake coming to him at all. I'm not telling you this so you'll pay it, she said. I know how that would look, another debt, another rescue, another reason to wonder later whether anything between us was ever separate from money changing hands. I'm telling you because you're the one person in this county I trust enough to hear it and not immediately decide what I should do about it for me. I wasn't going to offer to pay it, Ezra said, and something in his voice made her look at him more closely. I was thinking of Otis Latham himself, actually. Man's held 2 notes against my own family over the years, and both times he collected every last cent of interest he was owed and not a nickel more mercy than the law required of him. I don't imagine 3 weeks is going to move him much, whoever's asking. Then what were you thinking? That there's a wool contract come open this fall, Ezra said slowly, working it through as he spoke. Denning Brothers up in Cheyenne County lost their usual supplier to a bad lambing season, and they've been asking around for someone who can deliver 200 head sheared and baled by first frost. I've got the hands for it if your brother's willing to put in the work alongside mine. 3 weeks is tight but not impossible, and the contract price would clear that note with room left over. He looked at her steadily. That's not charity, Adeline. That's work paid fair, same as any contract between neighbors ought to be. Nobody owes anybody a wedding at the end of it. Silas took some convincing, 3 days of it, pride wrestling with plain arithmetic until arithmetic finally won out, and the 2 ranches spent the following weeks working side by side in a way neither family had managed since long before either patriarch had died. Adeline found herself out on the range some afternoons herself, bringing water and cold biscuits to men too busy to break for a proper meal, watching Ezra and her brother argue companionably over shearing technique, the way men argue when they've stopped measuring each other by an old debt and started simply working toward the same honest goal. The wool cleared at first frost, the contract price settling Latham's note with $11 left over that Silas insisted on splitting evenly between both families' accounts, over Ezra's objection that it wasn't necessary. It was the kind of small, stubborn fairness that Adeline had come to recognize as entirely her brother's own, separate from fear now, chosen freely, the way everything else in that autumn seemed to have been chosen freely for the first time in years. She found Ezra again on the same stretch of fence, weeks later, the last of the wool wagons long gone toward Cheyenne County, the evening air carrying the first real bite of the coming winter. "I've been thinking about your question," she said. "The one you asked me in the churchyard, about which day it was I decided you were marrying me for myself and not for some old debt." "And I think it was today," she said. "Watching you and my brother argue over shearing shears for 2 hours like a couple of old fools, neither one of you giving an inch, and neither one of you doing it because any ledger told you to. I think that's the first time I watched you choose something hard, publicly, with nothing owed and nothing to prove, simply because it was the decent thing to do." She met his eyes. "I'd like to ask you something now, Ezra Hargrove, and I want you to know there's no money sitting between us this time, no letter, no note against the West pasture. Just the plain truth of what I want finally, without anything forcing my hand." "Ask it," Ezra said. "Will you marry me?" she said. "Not because your father owed mine anything, and not because mine ever meant to forgive it, but because I've spent this whole hard season watching you be the kind of man worth choosing freely, and I don't intend to spend the rest of my life wondering what it would have felt like if I had." "Yes," Ezra said, and crossed the distance between them the same way he had once before, wire cutters forgotten in the dust. And this time when she said it back to him, it landed like a door opening rather than one quietly closing behind her. They married that winter in the same small church, with considerably less debt and considerably more certainty than either wedding that had come before it. Silas standing beside his sister with no fear left in his face, only the particular pride of a man who had finally learned the difference between what a family owes and what it chooses. The letter their father never sent stayed folded in the same drawer where Adeline had first found it, not hidden any longer, but kept, the way a person keeps a hard lesson they never want to forget the shape of. Water rights along the north fence stayed shared long after any ledger could have required it, the two ranches' fortunes woven together not by an old handshake between dead men, but by a season of honest work chosen freely by the living. And on the evenings, Adeline walked that fence line alone, the way she still did sometimes out of old habit. She found she no longer walked it turning over a question. She walked it simply because the land was hers now, chosen and paid for in full, by nothing heavier than her own free heart.